So we're welcoming all the participants for our Working From Home webinar. We'll just give a few minutes for people to all filter through and be online so that we can make a good start. So just as some introductions before we do launch in, we're in webinar mode. So when you come into the webinar, you'll be muted. It's probably best if you also have your video off. If you want to make a comment or ask a suggestion, we suggest you use the chat facility. There is also a Q&A in your menu line, but if it's on the chat facility, then we get to see it much more easily. We'll also have time at the end for questions, so plenty of time to have that discussion. We're scheduled to finish at 3:30, but happy for all of us in the panel to stay online and have a chat, answer your questions if we need to. So our webinar on working from home, the new normal. Today I'm joined by David Provan and Jeff Hode, and I thank both of them very much. David is Managing Director of FordWorks, and he's also an adjunct at the Griffith University. And I think many of you online will know David. But I'm particularly appreciative of him being here today because David's also a co-author in this chapter on the OHS body of knowledge on workers working from home. So Jeff Hode is also with us. He's Chief Safety Officer at Blacktown City Council. And Jeff is special also today because he was one of the OHS professionals we interviewed as part of developing the chapter. So for those of you who've read the chapter on the workers working from home, it was developed in response to the COVID shutdown, if you like. And so we really were developing new knowledge, and we did a survey and we interviewed OHS professionals for that. So if we look back, it's really only 4 or 5 months. Back in March, April, we had a sudden change to most workers working from home. For most of us, this transition occurred in a matter of a few days, and OHS professionals and managers had to adapt very quickly, some more easily than others in some organisations. I guess one of the major things that's happened here is we've been bombarded, really bombarded with media articles, LinkedIn posts, Twitter, and anything else that people could think of. And part of the problem here has been that everybody seems to have an opinion, have advice. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to take account of. And as just an example, try Googling working from home checklist and you'll be absolutely drowned in responses. So one of our concerns was that there is just so much information around. And one of the perhaps concerning areas that we saw for a while was worker monitoring packages being offered. And this was also being welcomed by some managers. But for the moment, let's not go there. That's something else to discuss. But it's just part of all the information that's been flying around about working from home. So how does the OHS professional respond to all this information? And, you know, someone said it's a few quick hacks. Is that what it's all about? And so when we got to this back in April, with all this information flying around at the AOHS and the body of knowledge, we realised that this was really a tsunami of information that was targeting workers who were working from home. The regulators and Safe Work Australia were pumping out information, and it tended to be all about regulatory compliance. One of the things that we felt that was really missing was information about managing the health and safety of workers working from home. And that information didn't really exist. So this was where we felt the body of knowledge was important. Overall, the body of knowledge's role is to collate research, look at leading edge professional practice, and in many times synthesize knowledge out of that to inform OHS practice. So as I said, in this case, we looked around and we said, well, where are we going to get information from to guide OHS professionals and practitioners in managing the health and safety of people working from home? Looked at the literature, not much there. So we decided to do a survey of professionals and practitioners, ask them questions about what are you doing, what difficulties are you having, how are you dealing with those difficulties, etc. And we interviewed OHS professionals as well. So this is the background to developing this chapter on the body of knowledge. And so, as I mentioned, David Provan has been a co-author for the chapter. And what I'd like to do is to ask David what he saw are the issues that when we were leading into this.
Thanks, Pam. Welcome, everyone. Look, I really think, I was really interested in getting engaged with Pam in drafting and co-authoring this chapter was, I think that we really need to have quite a holistic think about working from home. You know, I think if I'd liken it to something, working from home is almost, in my, the way I like to think about it, is like the new contractor management. If we think about our workforce as being sort of 50% of our own internal people, and you know, maybe 50% of our work in our organization is performed by contractors, we have whole kind of robust ways of thinking about how to make that work in partnership with our contractors. And so when I thought about working from home, the Gartner Projects people have done a lot of surveys. They'd surveyed sort of 4,500 HR managers prior to the pandemic, and then came back and resampled a whole portion of them. And their data shows that something like 48% of the workforce post-COVID is going to continue in a remote work from home type capacity for a material part of their role. So we're almost talking about 50% of our workforce that aren't going to be kind of in our buildings and in our fence and to deliver their work. Now, you know, organizations need to think about what that means for them, and you know, individual workers do as well. But I think the safety profession needs to think quite deeply and holistically about that. And the starting point for that is that I think we need to think about how we care for our people and how we support them to get their work done. And I'll speak more about that a bit later in the webinar. But our first approach and our first thought in relation to working from home can't be compliance. And that's just a statement I'd make. And we've learned about this when we've done the work with safety clutter, and we ask organizations and we ask safety professionals, what stops you from removing the things in your organization that you know don't add any value to safety? And more than 2 times the concern is about exposing the company to legal risk than actually removing something that might do harm to the workforce. So when we think about what Pam put up before about working from home checklists, just have a think about our role as a safety professional and making people, when they're working from home or prior to, fill out a checklist that checks their ergonomic seating position and their means of exit, and you know, whether they're using the right knives in their kitchen during their meal breaks, and whether they've got a fire extinguisher in their home study or not using power boards. Have a think about how that might come across to the workers in terms of how they think the organization cares about them. So what I think we need to think about is this compliance to care mindset, this holistic mindset, thinking about our workers. It might sound a little bit strange, thinking about our workers as people. And how working from home actually affects them. What do they need from their companies to get their work done? What do they need from their companies to cope with how the work interacts with their life? Some people aren't going to be happy about having to work from home and are going to be having difficulties in integrating that. I'm sure everyone on the webinar has experienced disruption to their work, even if they're quite experienced at working from home or working remotely. So the last comment I'd make before I hand back to Pam is that I think this can only work with an individual approach. It has to be a team by team, person by person, case by case approach to how organizations support their people to work from home. And Pam had mentioned this monitoring software and things like that. You know, you can get software that takes clips of webcams and checks if people's computers are in sleep mode, and something like 20% of companies have invested in that kind of a product in the last 2 months or 3 months or so. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what sort of culture we're trying to breed in our organization and what we and how we approach this. And the role, I'll talk a little bit again later about the role of the safety professional specifically in engaging in all of these types of conversations. But for now, Pam, those were the main things I wanted to say. Moving from compliance to care, it's not about legal obligations first. It's about understanding what the needs of the people are and how the organisation supports them to get those things that they need.
Thanks, David. I think they're really important ground rules and beginning to set the scene for a change in mindset. Jeff, when we were doing the interviews for developing the chapter, when we were talking together, you presented a really positive approach, even very early days, in thinking about the change to working from home. Would you like to give us some thoughts about how your organisation approached it, your challenges, the highlights and the lowlights, if you like, about what happened and what you did?
Thank you, Pam. I think if we'd followed the existing processes within the organisation, no one would have been allowed to leave the building. They were so constrictive as to really not be at all supportive and helpful. I think what COVID-19 did was force us in literally a matter of weeks to go from an organisation which was very, very conservative, hidebound and static to becoming highly mobile and highly flexible. One of the things that we did, in fact, the first thing we did was we threw the existing procedure for working from home in the bin. It was just not fit for purpose. We recognised immediately, as David has rightly said, a compliance model is never going to work. You can put as many rules as you like, all they are is creating barriers, frustration, and it's effectively communicating an essential that you don't trust your people. We certainly didn't believe that was the case, and we took a much more open approach, unlikely for an organisation which until the last few years had been dedicated to compliance. Now we actually said, look, this is not about compliance. If you think compliance is an objective, you've lost the plot. Compliance is an outcome. So forget about the compliance piece, start looking at what you're going to do with your people, not to your people, and I think you'll have a much better outcome as a consequence.
One of the other aspects you talked about was thinking about the concept of risk in relation to working from home. Did you want to expand on that a little bit for the people on the webinar?
Look, I'd love to. The first thing we actually said was, what is the risk from working from home? David's articulated a few of the more traditional things like, do you have a power board that's going to catch fire? Do you have an emergency exit? Look, that's all rubbish, to be honest. The likelihoods of risk you can now go down that path and say, look, if you've got wooden floors, you are banned from wandering around the house in socks, because the inevitable will happen. You'll fall over and kill yourself. Rubbish. I've got wooden floors. I'm wearing socks. Okay, it's my house. I'll do it. My rules. And the organisation has to realise its level of control doesn't extend that far. So we are really now asking our people to be a lot more conscious of the risks they're facing. And the example I used was in my own house. My biggest risk is quite a significant one. It's a 32-kilogram Labrador who likes lying at my feet. So every time I want to get up, I fall over the bloody dog. And sometimes that can be quite threatening sometimes. It's a big bloody animal and it keeps on moving around. Seriously, those are the more threatening risks that you're likely to occur in your house. But there are others. There are some really serious ones that we've got to understand. If you send someone to work from home and you're putting them, and they unfortunately have an abusive relationship, you actually are putting them in harm's way. Those are the things I think we need to be more serious about, the understanding of risk in a home environment.
So Jeff, would you like to tell us a little bit more from a practical point of view what your organisation has done in order to adapt to the working from home model?
When we threw away the old procedures, we basically said to people, look, this is pretty straightforward. You know your home better than we do. I'm not going to come and look at your house and give you the big tick or the big cross. We understand that you're unlikely to have all the ergonomics in the world, but do your very best. Monitor yourself and monitor the place where you're working. Most people will not have a traditional desk. My example is I've taken over the whole dining room. We don't use it very much anymore. I've been able to put multiple screens in. I'm nice and comfortable, and I'm sitting on an unergonomic chair. Now, the thing is, after working for a couple of hours, is my back sore? If the answer is yes, I need another chair. Okay, let's put it back to our people to manage their own risks. And certainly we've actually pushed back from the one or two Muppets who've come to us and said, oh, you need to equip my whole house with ergonomic furniture and a brand new super duper chair. It's like, really? No, if you feel like that, we've got a nice office for you back at work. and we're happy for you to work in that location. And you found that most people had to really decide how they would cope if they were a social animal. What level of resilience did they have to manage themselves in this new environment? Could they work by themselves? Could they work in isolation, so to speak? Because it's all very well being able to communicate like this, and it's a great way in my view, but if you're not used to it and you're sitting there day after day, week after week, and you're feeling lonely and constrained and you're missing that human contact, that'll affect your productivity and your performance, and it'll affect you as a person. So I think when we talk about the true nature of risk, it's a very different risk model than we normally apply to a situation. Someone's not necessarily going to fall down something or be electrocuted by something. It's going to be more subtle than that. It's going to be about just as much the mental as well as the physical.
That's great, Jeff. And I think the people on the webinar are starting to get a feel for how we developed our thinking through the development of the chapter. Talking to people like you, getting the feedback that we got from you, and similar, sometimes different perspectives from the other people that we interviewed. And so out of that, what we were able to glean was a series of guidelines. And so we got these guidelines, which included things like, think about people as individuals. They're not just a group of workers that you can send home. Think about the risk from a much broader perspective than the way we think about risk at work. Take a holistic view to things. So we ended up with a series of guidelines. And then when David and I sat down to think about how we were going to draw all of this together, there was bits missing. So we went back to the literature and looked at what literature existed, which wasn't a lot. And then we started looking at motivational theory about the issues around trust. And so if managers have got issues around trust, then the issue is what about motivating people in relation to their work. Now, before I go on to talk a little bit more about how we developed a model, Jeff or David, would you like to make any comments about this trust issue? David's already commented about our issues and perceptions of employee monitoring software. But Jeff, did you have these issues of trust in the organisation pre-going to working from home? And how do you see that trust has developed in the organisation?
We certainly did. One directorate, and the director herself basically said, I can't afford to send my people home because I don't know if they'll be doing their work. And it was a case of, do you really feel that way? And after we teased it out, it was more the fact that she was losing a locus of control over her people, or perceived locus of control. And once we'd sorted that particular issue of will I lose control over my people out, then she was much more willing to take on the idea of, okay, I'll let them go home and I'll actually trust them. For most of the organisation, trust has come quite naturally, particularly with those leaders in the organisation who already had the trust and confidence of their people. It was a very simple thing to say, okay, let's organise how we're going to do this and who's going to work from home on what days or what alternative locations, as we've also done, and let's just see how that goes. The other thing that comes into that is really recognising whom you can trust and in turn who can trust you. If you do have the confidence in your people and they do trust you, they will support. But likewise, you need to make sure that you're capable of communicating that trust to them. And I think for most of our leaders, it's been pretty straightforward. If you know your people, you know your organisation, you know your objectives, you know your workflows, you will very clearly see if someone's sitting at home on the TV, crunching popcorn and watching the daytime soapies. But for the most part, regular communication and contact with people gives you a really good flow about what they're doing, what they're achieving, what their obstacles are, just as a normal day at work. And your role then comes back to what it normally is during a day. It's to remove the barriers to their success, to facilitate them getting their jobs done. And I think that's a really, really important point. Trust is critical in this whole process. They need to be able to trust you, but likewise, you need to be able to trust them.
And I think that's, as it's turned out, that's been one of the key features that's come out of our model for working from home. David, do you want to make any comments around the trust issue or trust question?
Yeah, look, I think, Pam, all I'd say is that I agree that it becomes central, and it's why we tried to frame the chapter the way that it is, because the way that the safety professional approaches the whole working from home situation within their organisation can create or destroy trust. And that's why we tried to do that in a way that was evidence based, and we went to the theory and the research around different models of managing remote work. But I think it really is important. We know that we need trust to create open communication and psychological safety. And if there's any time where you need people to feel like they can put up their hand, it's when they're not with you physically, because you can't read any body language or any kind of emotion. You actually rely on people contacting you when they need help. So we'll talk a little bit more maybe about the role of safety professional shortly in trying to do that. But it does become the key to communication and supporting your people and delivering on your organisational objectives. So
this brings us to have a look at our model that we developed. And this didn't pop out easily. As I said, the guidelines came out, but we felt really we needed to put it together into more than just here's a few guidelines. So if I can just explain the model a little bit, there's two main things. We've already talked about the trust, and then the other part that we haven't really talked about in much detail is the level of ownership of the work by the worker. And I think this is also a key aspect that came out of our interviews, in particular with people. And when we did the analysis of the interviews, things like belonging and feeling part of the environment and part of the work, but it was more than just, let's all have a few Zooms and we'll all feel good. It was actually focusing on the work. And I think this is where also the productivity benefits come out. So the way the model can be read is if we start in the middle at the beginning, at the center with the white part. It's really about job design and how do we design the job so that there is ownership by the worker. So if the worker owns something, then that also deals with or helps the psychological aspects, because I feel part of this and I feel that there is value in what I do. So if we look at some of the motivational theory about ownership and feeling good about my work, some of the things that come out is autonomy with accountability, mastery and purpose. So when we look at the job design, there needs to be some autonomy over the task, what I do, when I do it, how I do it, and to some extent who I do it with. And if anybody is interested in following up some of this motivational aspects, the autonomy, mastery, purpose over task, time, technique and team comes from Daniel Pink's work around motivational theory. And you might say, well, how can I have autonomy over task, time, technique and team? It doesn't say that you're going to have total autonomy, but if I have some control over when I do it and how I do it, rather than people monitoring me, looking over my shoulder all the time, that's going to work for some tasks and not so much for others. But it comes very much back to some of the things Jeff was talking about being able to trust the workers to do things. And if you want to walk around in your socks, fine. If you want to do it later at night, provided you don't have to have other people's involvement, etc. And this autonomy is different to flexibility. With working from home, flexibility has been thrown around a lot. But flexibility might just be around a bit of time and when I do things. But this autonomy with accountability takes the concept of flexibility way, way further. And so if you've got some autonomy, part of the other part of having ownership by the worker is what Daniel Pink refers to as mastery, but he also refers to them as Goldilocks challenges. If you give people a job that's too simple or too complex, then they pull away from it. But so if the task has appropriate intellectual challenges, then people are going to strive for mastery. So that is part of the task or the job design. And the other thing which seems to come out really, really strongly is that I have to have a sense of purpose for what I'm doing. It's not just, are we going to make the dollars at the end of the week, or we need to get this out because someone said so. And so a really important part of this ownership by the worker is, why am I doing this? What's going to be the benefit for the organisation, the society, the whatever? So one of the things that we talk about in the chapter is actually your output measures. If your output measure is very much focused on numbers of things or dollars or whatever, but if the output measure can be framed in a way that's not purely monetary pay for the worker, then they get much more of a feeling of ownership, and then the trust issues become not an issue because they have ownership of the work, and they are tied into the work. But that's fine, but it's only ever going to work if you've got an organisational environment that supports it. So from the interviews and from the questionnaires and from the reading, we identified a number of areas in the organisational environment which were really important. Communications around belonging, goals that focus on organisational and team purpose, policies and procedures that support intrinsic motivation. Now, each of these are explained in a lot more detail in the chapter. But one of the really important things was guidelines rather than rules. If you shall be online at 9 o'clock irrespective, then that doesn't do much for ownership. If there's guidelines about how to set up your workplace, Jeff commented that they threw out the working from home procedure and the checklist. So guidelines on how to set up your workstation might be very, very valuable, but rules about you shall do this is probably not appropriate because it's the person's home and it might not work. So guidelines are really good. Leadership in our interviews came up over and over and over again. Leadership that was enabling rather than controlling. Also about diversity and respect. And the thing that was really, really important was, as Jeff has mentioned, you need to think about the environment within which you're putting people. So these workers that are working from home are individuals. They're not an amorphous group of people or objects that can just be manipulated in any way. So diversity and respect, diversity in its fullest extent of the meaning of the word, about people are people and are individuals, and we need to respect that. Inclusive language, and I think we all know what inclusive language is, about us and we rather than you and them. And timely and constructive feedback. And that's a fairly obvious thing from all sort of management principles, but particularly important when people are working from home and are distance. So if we've got that organisational environment, and you can see the arrows go both ways, they help the job design, but they're also going to contribute to the two-way trust. And we talked about trust by managers, but it's also got to be workers have got to trust their managers as well. And the big blue, dark blue box around this is that we've got to think about risk management in a much broader context than we perhaps have been used to. And Jeff has referred to this as well. So this was where our chapter, I think, it didn't conclude, but it presented this model that we feel encompasses a different mindset and all the information that we got from the work that we did. Jeff, you've told us a lot about your organisation so far, but would you like to give us some thoughts about your organisation and how the things that came out in this model perhaps are reflected in how you've adapted to things?
Thank you, Pam. I'm actually quite humbled how many points on the model we actually end up ticking. Certainly we saw a lot of very, very positive leadership take place. We also recognise the diversity of people in the organisation, which I think we're actually pretty good doing that on a good day. But it was good to see us actually consciously look at those who would benefit the most from working from home, those who could work from home, those who could not work from home as well, and then really try and deal with all the variables that came up with that. I love the idea of recognition of the key leadership, but recognise that communications is king in this whole thing. You mentioned ownership as well, and I thought ownership was a remarkably prescient comment to make, because ownership equals commitment. If people do not have the ownership, they don't have the commitment, you've got a problem on your hands. And I think it's really important for us to recognise that when we look at the model, the couple of the most basic fundamentals are there: communications, leadership, diversity, and I love the idea about talking about guidelines rather than black and white procedures. One of the things that we did, and it worked extremely successfully, was we basically moved teams into locations where they were not at home, but were totally independent and secure. One of my teams took over a tennis centre, and I wish I'd gone there myself. It was bloody luxurious. Really, really nice place to work. They loved being there, and we just cycled people through that. They still worked from home, and they occasionally came into the office, but we managed to create a balance of that people really, really liked, of work home, work home. And so there was no total isolation. And you know, I spent the whole week last week working from home because I had the flu, and I'm actually glad to be back at work today, because I actually missed that physical contact with people. Yes, I had plenty of meetings, plenty of Zoom meetings, plenty of phone calls, but it was just great to be back with fellow human beings. And I think we've got to recognise that. The other thing is that as you recognise, your job design is going to be something that you've got to have a very flexible approach to say, look, here's your procedure, and it says this, you'll do this, and this. Like, please, just spare me. What we did with our team was I think very straightforward. We worked out what the objectives we were trying to achieve, and at the moment we've got a couple of major projects on. One is managing COVID-19. The other one is sadly dealing with the consequences of a fatality earlier in the year with a member of the public. And that's created a whole number of changes within our organisation. And under the current environment, it's made our lives quite challenging, to say the least. We actually sat down and said, okay, how do we slow down? How do we actually look at doing our jobs without the stress that normally comes with it under these situations? And we agreed to put a number of projects which of lesser value and less criticality to the side, and said, okay, everyone slow down and focus on the main things. If we do X, Y, Z, top 3 things, worry about nothing else, you're going to be okay. And what's the worst that can happen is it not, it won't get done. No one's going to get hung for this. Off you go. And the team responded magnificently. They focused on a major project at short notice. They've achieved some amazing things. I've just come away from a meeting with the regulator, and when you have the head of the inspectorate turn up to work and want to have a chat, you can see that they're taking it serious too. And they walk away with a smile on their faces. Equally, you've managed to demonstrate something constructive. And the team are the ones who've achieved that. And it's great. And I'm able to go back to them and saying, look what we've done. Look what you've done. And I think that the whole issue of genuine recognition is so important. Telling everyone they've done a good job gets a little bit trite. Yeah, I know I'm doing a good job. Yeah, I do a good job every day. Patting me on the head and scratching me behind the ear isn't doing it for me. I need something more meaningful. And I think you've got to provide meaning and purpose in that regard for people, and recognition in that regard is one way. I love the model. I think it fits us as an organisation really well. And we're not one of the most flexible organisations in the world, although I've pretty well been shown a very different side of the business in the last 6 months.
Jeff, you're a pretty positive person, as people can probably tell. Any really hurdles, any really difficult areas that you've encountered through this process that you'd like to mention?
Look, one of the things we did very early in the piece was we went to people who had compromised immunities and said to them, look, you're a high risk person, or you've got an age factor built in, or you've had a medical condition. Would you like to work from home? And most of them took it up. A number didn't. And we had to then decide, how do we actually make you as safe as possible in the organisation? So where they were involved in public facing activities, we took them out of that and allowed them to do their jobs in different places. conversely, we had the opposite, where people who initially went home to work were coming back and saying, look, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to take my chances and come back to work. One lady was quite an interesting case. She had a double lung and heart transplant about 18 months ago. So she is high risk. And she was saying, I want to come back to work. So we actually had to respect that, at the same time protect her. I think one of the things that we've done is achieved a humane balance between what we as an organisation would like, what people have the capacity to do, and the will to do. I mentioned resilience earlier on, and I still think it's important. If you're going to work from home all the time, you need to be a very resilient and independent person to do that. You need to be used to doing that. It doesn't worry me too much. I've spent the last 20 years traveling around the world, working in locations where I'm basically working by myself. It was 20 years ago that all you needed was a mobile phone, a laptop, and an airport. You don't need the airport anymore. And I think it's important to know that that level of flexibility in work is fabulous, but it's got to be tempered with the fact that we are social animals, and we do need a degree of social contact. And I think that's a super important thing. Like everything, there's a balance involved, and that balance is an important one.
And Jeff, you're lucky you're in New South Wales, because you can do a bit of balancing. For those of us who are in Victoria, things are a bit more challenging.
Yes, indeed.
Which brings us to the crunch about what's the role of the OHS professional, and what can us OHS people do to implement this model or parts of this model to enhance the approach to working from home within our organisation. And I think there's quite a few challenges here, which David is pretty keen to give his perspective on what we can do and how we might approach that. David?
Yeah, thanks, Pam. I noticed, just before I dive in, I noticed we've got one question there. But if people want to start thinking about their questions, and either in the Q&A panel, I'll only talk for a couple of minutes, and then hopefully we can dive in and answer the questions that you've got, rather than sort of just guessing of what might be helpful to you. But I think we've heard all the cliches. We've heard that we're in unprecedented times, and it's landmark, and we've never seen this before, and that's all true, and that's all fine. And I actually think that's the case for the safety, for the relevance of the safety profession going forward. And there's a real opportunity here to change the way our organisations view us as a profession, and our usefulness, and our strategic capabilities, and our support of delivering on organisational objectives, and building, the cultures that our organisations are trying to build. And so to do this, I think we need to think, like I said, about compliance to care. And if I just go to Jeff's comments, which I loved your examples, Jeff, because I think what you showed in the way that you made decisions was you would make very different decisions if you were worried about compliance, as opposed to if you're worried about supporting your people. You make very different decisions. And I think the people who are listening could think through the choices that you had to make, and how their organisation might make those choices. And I can already see the first question we're going to answer that's got a very different set of choices in and around that. But I think if we go fundamentally to our role as safety professionals, our role is to understand work. Our role is to understand the risks that work creates, and then to proactively support and facilitate our organisation to manage those. And so who understands the most about their work? It's the people who do the work. So when we think about, like what Pam said about putting in place rules and processes as opposed to guidelines, like, people know how best to get their job done. And if managers are worried about them being less productive when they're at home, the worst thing for them to do is to try to then reach over and design the way that they do their work. The way to make them be as productive as possible is to ask them, your job. How is this job going to work when you're working from home? How are you going what do you need? What people do you interface with? What resources do you rely on to do your job? So it's taking that mindset of how we understand work and how we engage people. So to be quite tactical, I wonder how many organizations have given their leadership, all of their line management, training and capability development in how to have conversations with people to transition them effectively to working at home, and to continue to support them through that. I don't know, but I suspect there's been a lot of communication to managers, and a lot of direction provided to managers about how to have that conversation. And you really do need to do that consistently across the business, and the safety profession needs to support that to happen consistently. Because I think we've all heard the stories in the last month of, leaving it up to managers to decide how they want to manage their team. You'll have one team who are being told by their managers they have to come into the office, and another team who are indefinitely working from home. And that creates real challenges for organizational culture. So we come to the role of the safety professional. So how do you gather information about where your workers are at? So normally you might be able to go and do a work observation, do an inspection, but your workers aren't in front of you anymore. So how do you get insights into how they're going, how they're responding, how their managers are supporting them and meeting their needs? So I think if there's one thing that safety professionals do need to do is make sure that they've opened up those communication lines to all levels of management and the frontline workforce, and find ways to find out how your organization is functioning. I think importantly, I think we can help our organizations understand the connection between safety and delivering the organization's objectives. So we can play a real role because of the way that we understand work to connect the organization to each individual's tasks and make sure that, that the organization's objectives are being achieved, as opposed to just mitigating safety risk. I find it really interesting when I talk to some organizations about the role of the safety professional, particularly in terms of field resources, because some organizations have adopted the stance that field safety people are essential to delivering safe work. So they're still working and they're in the field. And other people have decided that their field safety professionals are not critical, so they're working from home. So now you've got a group of safety people who are normally every single day full-time in the field who are trying to do their job from home. So there's some real fundamental challenges for the safety profession in how we do this. But I think if we think of working from home as a strategic element to our management system, in the same way like my opening comments about contractor management, if we build we need to build entire frameworks in our organizations and entire guidelines around this, because this is going to be the way that organizations continue to work and evolve, even long after hopefully we get a vaccine for COVID-19. So Pam, that was all I really wanted to say kind of initially, but I'm really hoping that we get some good questions so that we can answer what the attendees want to ask.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Jeff. I unfortunately can't see the chat list.
I can.
You appear to be able to, David. So would you like to do the honours?
Yeah, so there's a question here that says, what's the legal risk when essential staff want to work from home but are denied by their line manager? So essentially we've got people it sounds like people in a healthcare setting who are being exposed to patients and other people who are near them, even though they're a back of house type of role, and they could do 95% of their job from home, but they're being told by their organization to come into work and being told not to wear masks because masks panic people. So it sounds like the WHS professional here really wants to know, how can I help? How can I influence my organization to understand whether, how do we mitigate the safety risk as well as kind of meet the operational demands of the business? And Pam, this reminds me of one organization I know, which is a very operational business, who had decided that early on in the pandemic that every single role was operationally critical. So when the government said essential workers still had to go to work or could still go to work, they decided that every single person in their 10,000 organization was an essential worker, because they all contributed to delivering the service, the public service that was being provided. So I suppose I'm interested, maybe before I give any comments, I don't know, Pam or Jeff, if you want to give some advice to this person who hasn't shared her name or his name, but any thoughts, Jeff? Because you influence a real organisation.
Jeff?
Look, I do have a comment in relation to that. I would see the role of the safety person to actually start debunking the whole issue of not wearing masks in a work situation where there's a genuine degree of exposure. I think the whole safety mask issue has been beaten to death, to the point where I think even the lawyers are now turning around and saying, yeah, this is not an abuse of your human rights to wear a mask. The Victorians seem to have made a marvellous job of wearing masks, and I think it's only inevitable that we in New South Wales and other states potentially are going to follow, and the sooner the better in my view. I would go to that organisation, I'd be working on the management team saying, listen, you need to understand there is genuine fear, but having someone wear a mask might make you go, oh, gee whiz, that doesn't look good. I don't give a rat's. You need to change what you're doing to make that person feel safe. So if they don't feel safe, then you're going to have all sorts of ongoing dramas. That's the change that needs to take place there.
Thanks, Jeff. Pam?
I guess my comment would be, and the issue of mindset comes up to me, and Jeff's comment about being comfortable. There might be the mindset that I like to see people's faces and I feel uncomfortable not. But now we're getting to a situation where people are saying, I feel uncomfortable if you're not wearing a mask.
Yes.
And so we're seeing a mindset change. Now, if this person with the question is in, for example, aged care, there might be some issues why people aren't changing their mindset, but that's another issue. And when David read out the question, my first reaction was legal. The question was, what's our legal obligations? And I thought, well, this is where we've got to get away from the compliance mode. If the fallback position is, what's our legal position or what's our legal obligations here, we've got a problem. And I think that's where we've been trying to come from with this webinar. Now, I may be speaking out of turn, but we're also having discussions with the OHS about running a second webinar where we have a discussion about the legal aspects of what is work from home and what isn't work from home, etc., and some of those other things. So I don't want it to devolve into a legal argument, because I think the whole thing we're trying to get here is to raise out of that. But there may well be some legal questions that people have. So perhaps if we put those to one side, if they truly are legal questions. But I think this really is an example of where we're trying to raise the discussion. And that's the sort of challenge that I think some of our professionals are having, is getting the first edge to get it out of that compliance and legal discussion.
Yeah, I agree, Pam.
David.
I think to honour the question and the person who's asked it, because some organisations do respond to their safety professionals only when they raise compliance-based arguments. And we saw Steve Bell, prominent OHS lawyer on the ABC News, talking about the Bunnings situation in Victoria here on the weekend. But look, how I would approach this, from a legal answer, is to say that, you know, you've got an obligation to demonstrate, you know, your risk reduction through the hierarchy of controls, and isolation, which is removing people that don't need to be exposed to the risk, is a higher order control. PPE in terms of masks is kind of like a lower order control than that. But having your people who could be isolated from the hazard, or could be protected from the hazard, to be in the workplace exposed to an unknown hazard, is not meeting that legal obligation to reduce risks as far as reasonably practicable. So look, I agree with you, Pam. I don't think it's a legal argument, but if you're for that question, if you're in an organisation that responds to legal arguments, then you might want to get some better. I'm not a lawyer, so please don't take that as advice. But that's how I would approach it, and I've been in those sorts of environments with managers who will only respond to a legal argument. We've got another question from Carolyn Moore. Hello, Carolyn. Go, Pam.
Just before you go to the next question, David, it does raise an interesting comment, because one of the reasons we started out on the chapter was early on, people were asking questions about what they should do, and it became very obvious that they weren't referring to their risk management principles. And you've just raised the question of the hierarchy of control. So I think in many cases, perhaps early on and less so now, don't know, but where some of us have forgotten our basic core principles of managing health and safety. And that is the risk management, the hierarchy of control, and to step back and say, what is the risk, as Jeff mentioned? And then to say, what's our hierarchy? And masks are bottom of our hierarchy, but still a very important element. But let's go through the same process as we would with any other risk. And I think in some cases we've lost that or forgotten about it in all the emotional discussion.
Yeah. So I think the person who's asked that question has just come back and said that the organisation tends to defer to legal as opposed to deferring to their safety professional expert. Look, if you want to have a chat offline, I'm very easy to get hold of, and I'd be happy to kind of give some more advice on how you might influence your organisation, if you like. Carolyn's asked a question. Hello, Carolyn. Thanks for joining. So she says, thanks, Jeff, for your personal story about what you've done in your workplace. She's feeling that there's a real focus on knowing your people and managing them with respect.
Yes.
Her question is around that domestic violence risk. noting that most do not disclose how organisations manage sensitively, or is it a case of perhaps of offering to keep in the workplace or supporting at home to see what choices people make? So you mentioned this before the webinar, and you mentioned it briefly in your first sort of early comments today. How have you done that to actually know how to create opportunity for people to reach out if they are exposed to risk with being more at home? And
look, I'd love to answer that, and Caroline, thank you for the question. It's excellent as usual. We as an organisation are deeply committed to the whole issue of our opposition to domestic violence. We have frameworks in place where I think we're fairly advanced in this whole area. When COVID-19 came along and the idea of working from home was first espoused, the organisation to go back to its employees and say, hands up anyone who's been bashed at home and we'll look after you, was never ever going to work. So what we did do was we went very, very much underground. We spoke to appropriate people in the organisation who did not have necessarily titles but had respect. And we said, have conversations with people, and if they decide to have a conversation with you, fantastic. If they build that level of confidence to a point where they'd like to come and have a discussion with us, we'll do so in complete confidence. And we were able to identify a number of people who said, look, I'm actually at risk if I go home. And we were able to take steps. But if we did it in a formal way, it would never, ever have worked. Again, this is using the power of your people. This is getting outside your formal structures. This is now looking at your social structures in your organisation. And for us, I'll never know whether it's an overwhelming success or not, but we certainly did have some success when we did that. And I think that will work far better than a formalised hands up who's being bashed approach, because I don't think that ever will fly.
Yeah, thanks.
David, can you see the rest of the chats?
Yeah, look, I think I think we're running low on questions. So surely people want to ask us something else. The person who'd asked us the questions, the first question had just made another comment to say that the second webinar sounds like a good idea, just to connect the safety profession with the legal profession, so that organisations can figure out how those two groups to work together. And then a comment there about is the expectation of the standard of safety going to be the same in the home and at work? Like if we do have ergonomic chairs in the workplace, but we let people work at home without ergonomic chairs, is that the right standard to be applying? And I think it's going to be a real conversation that organisations want to have. And I know there's different views that organisations have been taking on this. I think we need to have a holistic conversation about how we do that. The organisation still pays for me to stay in a hotel room and work at a desk in a hotel room without an ergonomic chair. So what's the balance of all of this? It's one of those complex issues where there's no simple answer, and to think that as a safety professional we can provide a simple answer, I think doesn't do a service in the long run. But look, I sort of just was rambling there because I was trying to wait for another question to come. It looks like we are away now. So, Kristen, thanks for your question. Two-parter. So part one, treating employees like individuals is necessary, but it requires more effort for managers, which is kind of their job, who may already be, I added that bit, who may already be overwhelmed and understaffed, especially if staffing cuts or hiring freezes are in place. Do you have guidance for how to provide leadership training that addresses this and helps make this feel more manageable? So how do we help managers make this whole situation feel more manageable when managers might just be looking to the safety team to say, give me the rules and I'll just tell the workers what it is, and then I don't have to have one-on-one conversations with my whole team? What have you done, Jeff, maybe to start with for your managers in terms of helping them understand how your organisation wants them to manage this?
Okay, we were very fortunate that by getting ready early in the piece, we had a situation where we pulled every manager in the organisation together. We spoke to them about the fact that there was the potential of a global pandemic. I think half of them thought I was mad and the other half thought I was right. So I was half right or half wrong, depending which way you looked at it. But what we did at that stage was saying, this is what's going to happen. We gave some predictors about the fact that were the virus to arrive in Australia, there's likely to be changes in the way we do it. There's likely to be lockdowns. There's likely to be a move to, and I think giving people that almost time, not a direct timeline, but a sequence of events that they could expect, and then introduce them to the fact of when this occurs, what are you going to do? How are you going to manage? When are you going to stop operating at work? When are you going to start operating independently? And to be honest, 99% of them had never thought of this before. But by now putting it on the table, it gave them an opportunity to start having a reflection. We then codified that by saying, we want you to build a pandemic plan for your area of responsibility. How are you going to look after your people as your number one objective? And you tell us how you're going to do it. Happy to come and give you advice or make suggestions, but you tell me what's the best thing for your people. And it was amazing. You know, we got a few people who were a little bit confused by the whole process. The majority came through and actually said, this is what I'm going to do with my people. This is how I will protect my people. It also exposed a few who had no intention of protecting their people. It exposed those who were going to force them back to work no matter what happened. You know, the last man dies, that's it. And we went, no, that's not the plan. We're going to work with you to do this. And that was, for us as an organisation, it was a completely new thing, but it worked. And I think it's still working now. The plans are still relevant and are still being used.
David, this came up in some of our interviews as well. And one of the things that we pulled out of the role of the OHS professional was around mentoring or arranging the mentoring of managers in order to adapt to this new way of managing. And I think that is really important, because we need to recognise that it will put many managers into their discomfort zone. And the reason why they want people in front of them is because that's their comfort zone. So if we recognise that it is a discomfort zone for managers, then how do we counsel them and mentor them in order to manage differently? And I noticed that I did see something pop up on the chat very temporarily that someone said, I've got hundreds of managers. Well, I guess in the same way as you would roll out any other process of empowering your managers or communicating or educating with your managers in a small or a large organisation. But I think we need to recognise that some managers will need assistance in order to change the way they manage. And that's no reflection on them. It's just one of those things that we're going to have to build into our change of mindset.
Yeah, I agree, Pam. And I think and providing those expectations and guidance material and capability development opportunities for line managers is the most critical thing to making the work from home thing successful. And if you've got hundreds of managers or thousands of managers, that's really challenging. It should be occupying a lot of your thought and your time in how can I support managers to support their teams and what do they need to be able to do that. I know there's a few comments there about it's difficult to separate the legal outcomes from the safety outcomes. You've got WorkSafe, you've got DHHS. Safe Work Australia, I don't think they provide a lot of information through this, but my personal opinion, not an AIHS opinion, is that I don't think they've done a great job on other than just kind of like copying and pasting stuff out of the Act and things like that. So look, they're always going to be connected together, and sometimes they're pushing in different directions, and the safety professional's stuck in the middle of that. But I think we need to play a leadership role in saying, look, our number one thing is caring for people and understanding what the real risk is and what we need to do about that. And I think that's the intent of hopefully the intent of both parties deep down. Look, we're about to go. There's just one part B that I think is really important. Is that the person, Kristen, had mentioned the remote work plan in the Body of Knowledge chapter. And I'm pretty sure that came from Genevieve Hawkins from Coles, Pam, which it's a fantastic appendix in there. I really loved that when Pam showed me that. And it's a great template to have a guided conversation with your workforce with no right or wrong answers and no tick boxes. So I think that's a great resource.
And I think that's where the guidelines come in, is that it's not meant to be totally standalone, that there is guidelines for the person and also for the managers that are reviewing that report with the worker. So just to round off, In the chapter, we did produce a little list of things about the role of the OHS professional, which I think, having had the discussion that we've had, are perhaps somewhat inadequate, but they were intended to just draw a few things together. And it's easy to put some guidelines down. It's not so easy to make them happen in the workplace, as I think some of the questions have illustrated. So the things that we had was about promoting a holistic approach, ensuring that psychological health was considered, and it's not more Zoom meetings. It's around the work design and all those sorts of things. Encourage recognition of and respect for diversity of the workplace or the workforce. And this was one of the things that I didn't enter the research for the development of the chapter with this in mind, but it just kept coming out so clearly. And I think Jeff's illustrated it very much today. Facilitating leadership, commitment and trust. And I think what's hidden in there is the discussion that we've just had about mentoring managers and arranging, supporting them in order for their management style, which fits with the next one, which was about facilitating purposeful and effective communication. Perhaps not so much now, but early days, there was some real pushback about I've been spending all week on Zoom and not doing any work, and why are we having all of these meetings? So purposeful and effective communication was one of the things, very much about keeping in mind your risk management principles and processes, although applying them in a broader context, facilitating job design, and the bottom one was meant to be adhere to professional ethics. The OHS professional may well be open to various pressures in this environment, but our professional ethics and our priorities continue to be important. And if in doubt, we've always got the OHS Body of Knowledge chapter on ethics and professional practice. So I'd really like to thank Jeff and David for their time today and for the people who've participated and their questions. I think this is such an important topic, and what I need to do is just remind people that the chapter's there and the link, and really like people to read it. We've had a few posts on LinkedIn, and I get a little bit concerned that people write opinions without actually reading the papers or the documents. So I'd like to think that you've read it coming into this webinar. If not, please read it, because we've really only just picked up a few of the perspectives of what's in the chapter. I don't think going forward is going to be easy. And I think Jeff and David have highlighted some of the issues of coming back to work, while they might be closer to it in New South Wales than we are, and what that adaptation will mean. So I think that it's been a great discussion. I've enjoyed it. I enjoyed working with David on the chapter, and I think it's a really useful contribution that we've made. But we couldn't have made it without people like Jeff and the others that we interviewed.
But I think, Pam, if I just dive in, Pam, we have slated that this is a chapter that we do want to do an early revision of, because we did yes. try to get it out to respond to the profession, and Pam, you were the reason that it happened. So, but we do want to review it within the next 6 months based on everything that we're learning, because it is a space that's under researched, and so all of your feedback in terms of what you experience and how to improve the chapter, we really want to get that so that we can re-release it more comprehensively.
And I think this is an example of, we're learning on the fly, and as OHS professionals, we've got to be adaptive, but in the body of knowledge, what we want to do is bring together people's learning. And one of the things that I do have on my agenda is to re-interview all those people that we interviewed back in April, perhaps in a couple of months' time, and see what their perspective is. So picking up on David's comment is that we would really like your feedback. My email is pretty simple, manager@ohsbok.org.au, and very happy to have any feedback, any experiences that you have that we could perhaps explore a bit more and build into the next chapter. Any final comments, Jeff?
I will make one, and that is that there seems to be a lot of concern about the regulator, the rules. My view is the regulator doesn't care how you get the job done. They just want to make sure you get the job done. So let's really focus on the prize, and that's the people. That's my final point for the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. David, anything else?
To reiterate, I think on the safety professional side, this is another opportunity for us to stand up and show that we're agile, we're pragmatic, we're considered, we understand risk, we understand the work in the business, we can coach leaders in how to support their people better, not just be the people who sit in the corner coming up with another checklist. So I'd encourage everyone to kind of lean into this space and be effective in your organisation.
Great closing comments, David. Thank you very much. And thanks to the OHS for putting this together. And so the webinar will become available as a recording to anyone who registered but missed being able to log in. And a little bit down the track, we will put it up on the Body of Knowledge website as well. So thanks, guys, very much. And thanks to everyone who participated. Just sorry we couldn't have spoken to you all, and it's just the limitations of the webinar model. But thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Jeff and David. I think we've already lost Pam.
Thanks, Dave. Always worth listening to what you've got to say. I thought that was a good session. There seemed to be some really positive feedback from the people who were participating, and I think that's a really encouraging thing. So fantastic.
No, well done, mate. It sounds like you've done a great job, and I think that's it. If you've got, that's it with the safety profession. If you've got the right kind of principles and mindset of how you approach this, you can solve anything that comes at you, even something like this, as you've kind of shown. So I think it's really good. Thanks, thanks, Penny, as always.
No worries. Thank you very much for taking up your time. I appreciate it.
I didn't ignore your email on the Northern Territory thing either.
I saw your response. Thank you. But I haven't responded to you.
That's okay. I even got Andrew sorted. So
you're amazing. I know. I was like, what? He's responded so quickly. What's going on?
Exactly. Yeah. What's going on?
What's going on, David?
All right. No,
I'll be in touch. I'm just going to go back to Jeff in NT and I'll come back to you.
Yeah, that's all right. No worries. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks. I can't believe Pam just left. Doesn't she understand the protocol of hosting webinars? All right.
Never mind. All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, David.
Cheers.
Take care. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks, Jeff.
See you.